3. Weitling and Proudhon. The discussions which now took place between Marx and the two brilliant proletarian theorists who had exercised such an important influence on his early development were incomparably more moving from a human point of view and incomparably more significant politically than Marx's criticisms of the post-Hegelian philosophers and of the true socialists. Weitling and Proudhon were both born in the ranks of the proletariat, both were blessed with healthy and vigorous characters, both were generously talented, and both were so favored by outward circumstances that they might well have been amongst those rare exceptions which helped to create the Philistine legend that anyone of real talent in the ranks of the working class may rise to the ranks of the possessing classes. Both men scorned to take this path, and instead they remained voluntarily in poverty and devoted themselves to fighting for their class and for their fellow sufferers. They were both well-built men, strong and vigorous, and made to enjoy the good things of life, but instead they gladly suffered the severest privations in order to pursue their aims. A modest bed, often with 3 persons in the same room, a piece of board as a writing desk, and now and then a cup of black coffee, that was the life Weitling was living at a time when his name was already a sound of fear in the ears of the great ones of the earth. And Proudhon was living similarly in a Paris attic, clothed in a knitted woolen jacket with his feet in clattering wooden clogs, at a time when he already enjoyed a European reputation. French and German culture went into the making of both men. Weitling was the son of a French officer, and when he grew old enough he hurried to Paris to study French socialism at the source. Proudhon came from the old free county of Burgundy, which had been annexed to France under Louis XIV. His associates always declared that he had a German head, and occasionally, a German thick head. But, one way or the other, when he awakened to intellectual activity, Proudhon felt drawn to German philosophy, whose representatives Weitling regarded as nothing but hazy Confucianists. Whilst on the other hand Proudhon condemned with extreme severity the great utopians who had meant so much to Weitling. The two men shared the same fame and the same fate. They were the first members of the modern proletariat to provide historical proof of the intellect and vigor of the proletariat, proof that it could free itself. And they were the first to break down the vicious circle in which the working class movement and socialism revolved. To this extent therefore they opened up a new epoch, and their work and their activity were exemplary and exercised a fruitful influence on the development of scientific socialism. No one has praised the beginnings of Weitling and Proudhon more generously than Marx. That which the critical analysis of Hegelian philosophy had given him as the result of speculative thought, he now saw confirmed in real life chiefly by Weitling and Proudhon. Despite all their discernment and farsightedness, however, Weitling never developed beyond the German artisan or Proudhon beyond the French petty bourgeois, and thus they parted from the man who was to complete magnificently what they so brilliantly began. It was the result neither of personal vanity nor obstinate dogmatism, though perhaps both played some role. The more the two felt themselves being stranded by the flow of historical development. Their discussions with Marx show that they simply did not grasp what he was driving at. They were the victims of a limited class consciousness which was all the more effective because it influenced both of them unconsciously. Weitling arrived in Brussels in the beginning of 1846. After his agitation in Switzerland had come to an end, partly owing to internal dissension and partly owing to the exercise of brute force by the authorities, he had left for London, where however, he was unable to get along with the members of the League of the Just. His efforts to save himself from a cruel fate by seeking refuge in prophetic arrogance made matters worse instead of better. Although the waves of Chartist agitation were rising high in England at the time, he did not plunge into the English working class movement, but turned his attention to drawing up a system of thought and speech with a view to founding a world language, and from that time on this became increasingly his favorite fad. He plunged recklessly into tasks for which his capacities and knowledge in no way fitted him, and as a result he fell into an intellectual isolation which separated him more and more from the real source of his strength, the life of his class. His journey to Brussels was certainly the best thing he could do, for if anyone could save him intellectually it was Marx. The latter received him hospitably, and this fact is vouched for not only by Engels, but also by Weitling himself. However, any intellectual agreement between them proved impossible, and at a meeting of communists which took place in Brussels on March 30, 1846, the two came to grips violently. Weitling had irritated Marx extremely, as may be seen from a letter written by the former to Moses Hess. Negotiations were proceeding in connection with a new publishing house, and Weitling insinuated that Marx and his friends were trying to cut him off from the financial sources in order to do well, themselves with well-paid translations. Even after this, Marx did what he could for Weitling. Writing to Marx on the basis of a report from Weitling, Moses Hess declared in a letter from Verviers on the 6th of May, "It was to be expected from you that your hostility towards him would not go so far as to close your purse hermetically so long as there was still something in it." There was in fact desperately little in it. A few days later Weitling forced matters to the point of an irreparable breach. The propaganda conducted by Krieger in America had not justified the hopes both Marx and Engels had placed in it. The Volkstribune, a weekly newspaper which Krieger issued in New York, carried on fantastic and gushingly sentimental propaganda in a fashion both childish and pompous. This propaganda had nothing to do with any communist principles, and it tended to demoralize the workers utterly. Even worse than this, however, was the fact that Krieger began to send out grotesque letters to rich Americans begging them for financial support for the paper. As he presented himself in America as the literary representative of German communism, its real representatives had every reason to protest against the compromising association. On the 16th of May, Marx and Engels and their supporters decided to make a detailed protest in a circular to be sent to Krieger's paper for publication and to all their sympathizers. Weitling was the only one who refused to associate himself with the protest, and he sought to justify his attitude with various empty pretexts. The Volkstribune was after all a communist organ, and it was suited to American conditions. The communists had enough powerful enemies in Europe without looking for trouble in America, particularly against their own comrades, etc. However, he was not satisfied with his refusal alone, but wrote a letter to Krieger warning him against those who had signed the protest as cunning intriguers. The League, which is rolling in money, and consists of perhaps a dozen or a score of individuals, has nothing better to do than fight against me, the reactionary. I am to be polished off first, then the others, and finally their friends, whilst in the end, of course, they will cut their own throats. And tremendous sums of money are now coming in for this sort of thing, whilst I cannot even find a publisher. Hess and I are quite alone on this side, but Hess is boycotted also. After that Hess also abandoned the deluded man. Krieger published the protest of the Brussels communists, and it was also published by Weidemeyer in the Westfälisches Dampfboot. However, Krieger published Weitling's letter, or at least its worst passages, as a sort of antidote, and persuaded the Social Reform Association, a German workers' organization in America which had chosen Krieger's weekly as its organ, to appoint Weitling as editor and to send him the money for the journey. Weitling accepted and disappeared from Europe. In the same month, May, the breach between Marx and Proudhon came nearer. In order to make up for the lack of an organ of their own, Marx and his friends issued printed or lithographed circulars, as in the Krieger affair, and at the same time sought to establish permanent correspondence connections between the various big towns in which there were communist groups. Such corresponding bureaus, as they were called, existed in Brussels and London, and one was to be set up in Paris. Marx therefore wrote to Proudhon asking him to cooperate. On the 17th of May, 1846, Proudhon sent a letter from Lyons, agreeing, but pointing out that he would be able to write neither often nor much. At the same time he utilized the occasion for delivering a moral lecture to Marx which revealed to the latter how wide was the gulf which had opened up between them. Proudhon now professed an almost absolute anti-dogmatism in economic matters and advised Marx not to fall into the error of his countryman Luther, who, after the overthrow of Catholic theology, had immediately begun to found a Protestant theology to the accompaniment of a great wealth of anathema and excommunications. We should not give mankind new work by creating new confusion. Let us rather give the world an example of wise and far-seeing toleration. We should not play the role of apostles of a new religion even if that religion is the religion of logic and reason. In other words, like the true socialists, Proudhon wished to maintain that pleasant confusion whose abolition Marx considered the preliminary condition for any real communist propaganda. Proudhon also abandoned the revolution in which he had believed so long. I prefer to burn property in a slow fire rather than give it new force in a St. Bartholomew's night of property owners. He announced that he had given a detailed explanation of how this problem was to be solved in a work which was already half printed, and promised to submit it to the scourge of Marx's criticism gladly in the expectation of his revenge. In passing I may remark that in my opinion the situation is, our proletarians in France have such a great thirst for knowledge that we should get a bad reception if we offered them nothing to drink but blood. Proudhon then defended Karl against whose misunderstood Hegelianism Marx had warned him. Owing to his ignorance of German, Proudhon was dependent on Grun and Ueberbeck in his studies of Hegel and Feuerbach, of Marx and Engels. He informed Marx that Grun intended to translate his, Proudhon's, latest work into German, and asked whether Marx would assist in the distribution, adding that this would be honorable for everyone concerned. The conclusion of Proudhon's letter sounds almost like mockery, though it was probably unintentional, but in any case, Marx can hardly have found it edifying to be described as bloodthirsty in the bombastic gibberish of Proudhon, and in consequence the doings of Grun gave rise to even stronger suspicion. This was one of the reasons why in August, 1846, Engels decided to go to Paris for a while and take over the reporting there, for Paris was still the most important center of communist propaganda. It was necessary to inform the Paris communists at first hand about the breach with Weitling, the Westphalian publishing fiasco, and about those various other matters which had stirred up the dust, particularly as Ueberbeck was not altogether reliable and Bern is still less so. In the beginning the reports sent by Engels from Paris, some to the Brussels corresponding bureau and others to Marx personally, were quite hopeful, but gradually he came to the conclusion that Grun had thoroughly mucked up the whole situation. The work mentioned by Proudhon in his letter appeared in the autumn of the same year and turned out in fact to lead into the morass as his letter had already indicated. Marx then proceeded to wield the scourge of criticism thoroughly, as Proudhon had invited, but all the revenge that the latter took consisted in a certain amount of round abuse.